Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and today I'm going to be asking an important question about vaccine deaths. Were these hidden in the original trial for Pfizer? And this is really because of a recent preprint paper that I'll be sharing with you. And this preprint paper here is this forensic analysis of 38 subject deaths at the 6 month interim report. And I'll be comparing it to the original uh, article. This was a very important article for the promotion of vaccines across the world. And it was the first breakthrough in terms of the pandemic. And so I'll be looking at the deaths over a 6 month period of time because this was the first time that it was analyzed. So this is important stuff. And I'll break down what I think is important about this information. Before I start, for those people who are interested in the upcoming webinar, Pandemic Weight Gain and Prediabetes, what you may not know about, I think that you should click on the link and you can register for free for this presentation. It's coming up in 2 days' time. And if you have missed it, there will be a course afterwards for you to take a look at. It really is about explaining to people why it is that they struggle to lose weight once you reach the middle ages and what the mechanism is from a physiological point of view. So, if you're interested, please click on the link below. So, coming back to this question about the vaccine deaths, were these hidden in the original trial? Really, really interesting question. And this information was shared with me, and I was really fascinated to go through it. And because of that fascination, I'm sharing it with you. So, let's start with some basic things. The first thing is here is that this is a preprint paper. It's not yet peer reviewed. That means that it has been written by these scientists. It's Corinne Michels here. And this was done on the 4th of September, 2023. So it was been submitted for it to be analyzed, peer reviewed, and then a decision made as to whether or not things need to change. That's important to highlight, just in case there is information in the paper that is flawed. It will not be challenged until it has gone to peer review. But I'm less interested in that and more interested in the specific details that the paper was looking at. And I'll come to that in a second. So, what they did in this paper is that they then took a look, and they have it here. This is the first study of the original data from the Pfizer BioNTech mRNA clinical trial to be carried out with a group unaffiliated with the trial sponsor. So, business is business. Pfizer is a pharmaceutical company. They want to have their products utilized across the world. They do their work with regards to safety, but in the same way that there is a regulator who is independently looking at what they're presenting, you can also have independent scientists challenging and making sure that what they are saying is actually factually correct. And this is essentially what they have done in this case. So, moving along to what they said in the paper here. So, they then looked at 38 trial subjects. And these trial subjects who died between the placebo and the vaccine group between July 2020 and March 13th, 2021. It's their 6 month interim report. And just so that you understand the principle of the vaccine group, the two groups, is that it was total of about 44,000 subjects, which were split in half. One half had the vaccine, the Pfizer BioNTech mRNA vaccine, and the other group was a placebo. So they didn't know who was who, so they were blinded. So a proper trial looking to see the outcomes when they compared the different groups. The final point I'll make with regards to this is here they found an over 3.7-fold increase in the number of deaths due to cardiovascular events. That's really the point that I am going to be focused on. And so we'll come back to that in a little bit. But let's just start with what I think is this groundbreaking paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in December of 2020. And just so we all realize, is that at that time the world was scared. You had lots of virus circulating, and they needed a vaccine desperately. Into the gap steps the Pfizer BioNTech mRNA vaccine. It was first on the scene before even the Moderna one. And so time was essential when it comes to acting on this. So they gave us some information here, and you can see that there were 43,548 participants. As I said, they split them into two groups of 21,720 for the vaccine versus the placebo, which was just normal saline. And then it highlights this 8 cases of COVID 19 with onset at least 7 days after the second dose among participants assigned to the vaccine, compared to 162 cases in the placebo group. Now, this was big news. And this was part of the reason why governments across the world jumped to say, listen, everybody must get it. They were so greedy that they didn't share the vaccines with the rest of the world who were in the developing world. The first world hoarded it because they thought, wow, here we've got something that is going to stop the pandemic. And so every politician then wanted the credit of being able to stop the pandemic with these vaccines. And so that was the kind of thinking that was going on at the time. So when they saw that there were only 8 cases in the vaccine group compared to the 162 in the placebo group, that was all guns firing. Let's go ahead and get this sorted. So they didn't realize, however, that there were problems down the line because the effect of the vaccine waned. But how would they have known it at that time, one could argue? But let's go on with regards to the paper. And so, a further point that I've highlighted here in the paper, which you can read yourself, is that the first primary endpoint was the efficacy of the vaccine against confirmed COVID 19 with onset at least 7 days after the second dose in participants who had been without evidence of infection. All they were saying here was that essentially, when it came to determining what they considered a vaccine infection, you had to have had the first dose, then 3 weeks later, the second dose, and then 7 days after the second dose. That's the start point to count infection, compared to the placebo group, which was just counting infection along the way. So straight away, you would have a gap in terms of determining if somebody was positive in terms of infection. So this is part of the reason why the trial looks so good. The other point that I wanted to highlight from this original paper was the timeline. You can see here between July 27th, 2020 and November 14th, 2020. That's when they screened all these people, and that's when they got it from 152 sites worldwide. So this was a big study, and they got it going very quickly. Actually, they started the preparation from January 2020 to get this trial ready so that they could have a vaccine within a year. So, in that sense, they did good work in terms of getting outcomes very, very quickly. So, that was the critical thing. And now we come to the crunch of what I look for. Because at the end of the day, even if you have benefit with regards to reducing infection and reducing severe COVID 19, the question still needs to be asked, do you reduce all cause mortality? That's for people who die. And so this is the other bit now that was very important. And when I saw the paper, I headed to this section straight away to try and get some clarity. So when they looked at adverse events, so they spoke about a number of adverse events, but in terms of death, 2 vaccine recipients died, one from arterial sclerosis, that's thickening of the arteries, and one from cardiac arrest, compared to 4 from the placebo group, 2 from unknown causes, one from a hemorrhagic stroke, and one from a myocardial infarction. Critically, no deaths were considered by the investigators to be related to the vaccine or placebo. Now, that's brilliant news. If you can have a vaccine that stops infection and doesn't cause death, I mean, wow, that's like the dream situation for pharma, politicians, governments. It's no wonder that they jumped on it. And when you look at the image here, this is what it showed you from the paper. They were looking at the timeline with regards to infection. This is point zero here. This is what they call the cumulative incidence of cases in terms of percentage. And the blue dots or blue squares are the cases of in the placebo group. You can see that rising steadily. And the dots here in dark blue are when patients died of COVID 19. You can see in this early part, they've expanded it a bit. So in the first, what do you call it, the first 21 days here, there's not a lot of difference between the vaccinated group and the placebo group. But then you have this flattening, which is then extrapolated here, and this is where the vaccine group had the benefit of reduced infection. Interestingly, they still had one COVID 19 death here. And that at the time stood out to me because I said they had 9 cases of COVID 19, of which one died. Compared in the placebo group, they had 162, and the percentage was much smaller in terms of death. But at that point, nobody knew that this effect was not going to be long lasting, lasting for years, almost for typical vaccine. So this was the situation that we had at the end of 2020. And this is what led to that major push. I still maintain that for all the people who were pushing for vaccines in the first world, if this had continued to work as well as they had hoped, they would have sacrificed the rest of the developing world who didn't have vaccines. So, in a sense, karma has it that it probably didn't work as well as they had hoped because the rest of the world would have suffered simply because of the greed associated in the first world. Can you imagine? They took it all the way down to the lowest risk cohorts of giving them vaccines without sharing the vaccines to other countries to give to their high risk groups. That in itself was one of the biggest failures for everybody who was pro vax and pushing it at the time to miss that and to not consider the rest of the world. In a sense, as they say, karma does come back. But that's a different question. So, what's the relevance of this in the context of the paper, the original, well, not the original paper, but the follow up paper? So, in this paper, what they then did is that they went through it and they looked at the timeline here. And so they clearly highlighted that this was the start, week 5, week 6 going out. They looked at the data cutoff here at the 14th of November 2020. And these lines here represent the placebo group in gray and the vaccine group in black. And these were the deaths that occurred. And you have the cutoff here date here, but then you have the 6-month interim period out here. Now remember, they were so excited about these results that even people who were in the placebo group, this is what this slash dash line means, they then offered them the vaccine and said, listen, this is too good for you not to have it. So if you want to get it, you can then get the vaccine. And so that's what killed the control group, because normally you would follow that control group of placebos for up to 2 years to see what the outcomes were compared to the vaccine arm. That was all destroyed because of the excitement about overcoming the pandemic. So, what were the outcomes? What did we find when we looked in detail at the deaths? And just so that we break it down, I'm going to show you what happened in terms of the placebo group with regards to deaths. So, this is the placebo group here. And what you're seeing is that you have here the first, in terms of the people who died, their age, the date that it was registered, and how many days after the event, the injection, this occurred. This one was an undetermined cause. This one was a hemorrhagic stroke. This one here was an overdose. And then there were two myocardial infarctions that occurred. And this shows you the day that it was registered in their system. And so going down the line, you have here cardiorespiratory arrest. Then you have a few cases of COVID 19. This is COVID 19, COVID 19 deaths, COVID 19 deaths. So, this is one of the reasons why they were also pushing to say this was a huge benefit if this many people were dying of COVID 19 compared to the vaccinated group. Important that a group deaths, say for instance, aortic rupture, metastatic disease, dementia, these are really clearly not related to the placebo injection. These are things that probably would have happened otherwise. So that's what would have happened. That's what happened in the placebo arm over 6 months. Question is, what happened in the context of the vaccine arm? This is where it gets really interesting. So you have here now, suddenly, if you look carefully here in terms of the time frames, and you have here, this here is arteriolosclerosis, which technically is pointing to a cardiac death, unless you very clearly have an explanation as to how this patient died of arteriolosclerosis. This one is sudden cardiac death. This one is cardiac arrest. This one is cardiac arrest. This one here, and again, is arteriolosclerosis. Another cardiac arrest, another cardiac arrest. This is cardiac failure. This is cardiac arrest. This is myocardial infarction. This is cardiac arrest. There is one case of COVID 19. So when they were focused on the benefit to the cohort, when you compare it, there is clear benefit in terms of reducing severe COVID 19. What they didn't speak about was the fact that this is an unusually high amount of cardiac related events. At that time, I guess you had to remember that even the slightest mention of myocarditis was considered to be misinformation. This was not, according to them, considered to be accurate. But if they had accepted that point about myocarditis, there would have been a high probability that we would have taken those sudden cardiac deaths more seriously. Was that an error? Well, time will tell. Now, here's a really interesting question about the recording of these deaths. Now, when they looked at, and this is getting back to the paper because it then broke it down in terms of time frames, they looked carefully at the vaccinated subjects, looking at the date of death and then the officially recorded death to the clinical files. So here is the first patient here, 13th of September, recorded on the 24th of September. And so there was a delay of 11 days. In the second patient, you have here the 19th of October, 25th of November, 37 days. Now, the reason why this is in gray as opposed to white is what the authors of this paper did is they were specifically looking at the fact that if you had included these patients here in terms of their date of deaths, it wouldn't have been two deaths. Actually, up to the 14th of November, you can see here, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 deaths that occurred in the context of the vaccine. And if you took it down to the 21st of December or even the 24th, look at that, all the way down here, suddenly these numbers of deaths were quite significant. The question is what was the delay? This patient here had a 26-day delay, so then they weren't included in that original paper. This person here just missed it as well, 11th of November, 18th of November, 7th. This would have had a significant impact on the adverse event profile in terms of death. Was that a mistake? Was that just coincidental? We don't know. What I do know is that even after the paper was written, there should have been a responsibility to look at the deaths over that 6-month period of time. And I am trying to understand how is it that the researchers, the scientists, Pfizer's regulators, internal regulators, did not think that this amount of events related to the heart were not actually significant. Now, it's important for us to reflect on where we are now, because at the moment we do have a problem with excess deaths. We seem to have a problem with random people having cardiorespiratory arrest. I recently spoke about this, and it seems as though no matter how much you raise the point, there is a failure to acknowledge that we could have a problem here. From my research, the autoimmune research, it makes perfect sense. If you had autoantibodies to ACE2, it would target the lungs, the heart, and the kidneys. That's the primary source. The heart would show up first because any disease in the heart can cause sudden death. Doesn't mean that there isn't damage to the lungs or the kidneys. But that, to me, is the obvious question. As I come to the end of this presentation, my point of reflection for you is just look at the yellow. Of that 21 deaths, and you have to remember, compared to the placebo group, which was only 17 deaths, of which I would have taken out a few of them because they were not necessarily relevant. Take a look. Yellow is the cardiac. I'll leave you to think about it, and we do need to get answers. There is a responsibility from governments and regulators to make sure that we are not missing something that could be important. My view is, without acknowledgement, there is no opportunity for mitigation. My responsibility is not to prove that there is a problem. My responsibility is to ask the question, and the regulators need to check. Have a good evening.